Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown. You are watching the very first installment of Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. Tonight's special launch edition is an hour-long broadcast coming to you live from our Johannesburg studios. My guest is South African President Jacob Zuma, who joins us for a broad-ranging interview covering the state of the South African economy. We also find out how and who formulates policy in the ruling African National Congress, and we put South Africa's foreign policy under the spotlight. Later in the program, we will be joined by business leaders, economists and government advisors from some of the continent's leading economies. Mr. President, good evening and welcome.
Good evening to you and to the listeners.
Thank you so much. In 2008, Mr. President, the global economy was hit by a financial crisis, from which South Africa and other economies are yet to recover. South African growth rates haven't approached their 2007 peak, and growth forecasts are currently trending downwards. What, Mr. President, is your government doing to address this crisis?
Well, it is true that the crisis, ever since it began, it has had very heavy impact globally in terms of the economy. As you would know, at first, we came together as South Africans and said, how do we handle this? What was absolutely important at that time is that it was business, government, and labor. We came together and worked out some packages how to deal with the impact. It also came at a time when we were having quite a lot of economic activities in the country as we were preparing for 2010 FIFA Soccer World Cup. Those two factors, among others, in addition to our financial discipline, fiscal policies, we were able to, in other words, to go through. It has never gone away. I think it has been there, it has come back again. I think heavier this time, as you know that Europe, Eurozone in particular, has been having difficulties. It is having a very heavy impact. I think our economic growth has indeed felt the impact. So instead of moving at a target which we had projected at the time, we had to work out a very slow kind of pace of the growth. So as a government, we have worked out a number of economic programs to implement our economic policies. We have, for an example, a very major infrastructure program that we are getting in, which we believe will open up a space for quite tangible investment that could, in a sense, weather the storm, create jobs, but also try to grow the economy. But that is within our policy choices that we have made. As you know, we said we are embarking on the new growth path. We should be driven by 6 drivers, and one of those will be the infrastructure. So we have focused on that one and elaborated on it in terms of the projects and programs. I believe the efforts that we are undertaking will certainly see us through the process of this, if we call it repression or
yes.
whatever.
Mr. President, I wanted to draw your attention to the point that you made about infrastructure. Obviously, in your State of the Nation address, you spoke very broadly about that. Can you give us some kind of update now that we're sitting, in August? Where are we with this rollout plan? What is your initial sense of how it's going?
I think it's going very well. We have started in other areas some of the projects. For an example, in the seaport in the Eastern Cape in Kucha, there are very specific things that are already going on there. The plans are in fact very much advanced. As you know, it's the first time that we have such a program that is national, that has to be coordinated nationally. The colleagues that are working on it have very specific programs with specific periods within which we'll be able to launch different SIPs, as we call them. There are about a number of them, about 17 of them, that are going to be put in place. So the work is going on. We are trying to deal with what would be other kind of bottlenecks that need to be dealt with that had never been dealt with before. But that program is going very well. We receive progress reports in Cabinet continuously. I'm very pleased that we have made a lot of progress, and I'm sure when we finish this year, we'll be able to say where we are in terms of the very specific ones that we are dealing with.
So you're confident, Mr. President, that the infrastructure rollout is on track and that shortly we will be able to get an update of where things are at?
I'm very confident indeed, absolutely.
Now, Mr. President, unemployment is of course one of the most pressing problems in South Africa. Everyone's agreed the unemployment figure standing at 25%. Yet inside the ANC and its alliance, there's no agreement in a real way how to move forward, to address this problem. What, in your view, should we do to be dealing with these structural and unyielding joblessness that South Africa's economy continues to face?
Well, I'm not certain whether I could say sitting here there is no agreement within the alliance.
Enlighten us, Mr. President.
Because I think we have just emerged from the policy conference, wherein there has been a general agreement of the direction we must take. That has come on top of the kind of programs that we have. There are specific things, as I said. For an example, I talked about the new growth path. It's agreed. Nobody disagrees with it. That's an important kind of a framework in terms of the economic approach. We have identified 6 drivers to help it to move forward. It's agreed. There's nobody who disagrees with that. And as I said, we have picked up, one of the 6 is infrastructure. And everybody agrees with it. Nobody disagrees with it. We have already, almost at the finishing touches of the national plan, and everybody agrees with that. It is supported overwhelmingly. And it contains a lot of economic elements that are, in a sense, together with what we are doing. So in terms of the programs that we are putting in place, I don't think there's disagreements. I think there was a debate in the policy conference on the issues, and again, to show that there isn't much disagreement rather, by the time we emerged out of it, we were clear where we are going. So I don't think there's much of that. There could be, of course, people who might be saying a few things here and there. South Africa is a democratic country. People are prepared to express their views, to utilize the possibilities. But generally, in terms of economic policies, I think we are agreed.
Okay. Mr. President, part of South Africa's jobless problem is, of course, the low level of skills in some of the sectors of our economy. Now, South Africa spends comparatively a high percentage of its GDP on education. But the question I want to put to you, Mr. President, is are we getting value for our money? Should we be doing things differently in education?
Well, education, one of the things that we should always bear in mind that education has a very specific history in South Africa. It was deliberately worked out in a particular way for the majority of the people, historically. The majority of this country, they were not skilled. They were left unskilled. So since 1994, we've been tackling that issue. As you know, for an example, in 2009, we identified 5 priorities. Key among these, which is an apex of priorities, is education. We've looked at it very seriously. We even divided one department into 2, which was an indication of our focus to create a basic education so that there would be very straight focus as to what do we do at the foundation of education and higher education. And we have looked at how could we quicken the process. We have talked about learnerships, even at the level of industries. Partnering with the private sector is a huge challenge given the history. I think we are doing things, in our view, the way we could. I don't think we could say we could do things differently in terms of our policies, in terms of what we are trying to do, but we are dealing with a kind of culture in terms of education. That in itself is a challenge. But I think we are doing our best. You would appreciate that, for an example, the results, the matric results, have begun to pick up, to improve gradually. I think that indicates that we are doing it right.
Now, you mentioned the policy conference earlier, that important decisions and discussions were held there, but many people felt that they were confused after the policy conference, particularly around policy direction inside the ANC, particularly in relation to the economy. Mr. President, can you tell us who and what makes policy in the ruling party, and how are the different schools of thought that make up the ANC accommodated when policy is unpacked and debated in the party?
Well, who makes the policy of the ANC? It is the ANC members at all levels. As you know, our branches participate very vigorously leading up to the conference. There's a period within which we generate documents on various aspects of the economy and other aspects of life, and they are taken to the branches who discuss these greatly and consolidate their views at the provincial level. So by the time they come to the conference, they know exactly how they would want the policy to be shaped. And this is what happened. And we discussed that. We also have in the conference the representatives from the alliance partners. We also have even deployed cadres, not necessarily branches, and the leadership. That kind of collective, that's a collective that discusses the policies and emerge with agreed kind of positions. So that's how the policies in the ANC are formulated and finally concluded. Of course, the National Policy Conference is in fact a conference that recommends policies.
So it doesn't make decisions?
It takes decisions which are recommendations to the National Policy Conference, to the National Conference, which will then, for an example, be held in December, wherein final decisions will be taken. So that's how the policy moves. And I think the manner in which we deal with it is one of the best, and I actually think we are the only ones who do so, who organize the National Policy Conference to look at policy from all directions, not only within ourselves. We actually open up to everybody to make comments. So our policy, the process emerges at the end with a kind of policy that has gone through a very, very thorough process. We then make recommendations to the conference, as we would have it in December, that will look at them again. That will now be, much as it is by and large the same people with additional other people, would be looking at it and then finalize. As we move from the policy conference to the national conference that will finally take decisions, we also begin to discuss the very same one, to refine them, to make them even more refined, as it were. Mm-hmm. So I think the policy is very thorough in the ANC that produces finally the policies. But
there's often, Mr. President, a confusion between policy discussions and policy decisions. Often, for example, let's take the issue of my nationalization. At what point does the debating stop? And at what point are we taking decisions and implement it to prevent endless uncertainty and instability? Business people looking toward trying to figure out where the ANC is going in terms of overall economic policy. At what point do we stop discussing and at what point, is there action? Can you just explain how that works?
Well, there's no confusion in the ANC. We're very clear, as it were. If I could repeat, we generate documents that begin to say this is how we think our policy should look like, and they are discussed from the branches upwards. We get to the National Policy Conference. These are presented as the documents that must be discussed. And we then go to commissions, wherein we are given more space to debate these. And in the commissions, things are discussed, particular conclusions are reached, which then are presented to the plenary. The plenary must decide whether we accept the conclusions as emerging from the commissions. And once they're presented, if it's not agreed, it's debated and concluded there. If it is agreed, that's where the agreement comes. They become resolutions of the conference. That's how it goes. That's why, for an example, on the matter you are referring to, of nationalization, as you would remember the process, the National General Council that was held, which comes in between conferences of the ANC, when the matter was discussed, the ANC took a very clear resolution that we need to do a research on this matter. And a team was identified that looked at this and researched. It gave a report in the policy conference. We then discussed the matter. That's why at the end of the National Policy Conference, the issue of nationalization was not accepted. We still stick to our mixed economy position wherein the state must intervene. That position is clear. We have been articulating it. I don't think there's anyone who can say I'm not clear what's happening. That's a conclusion reached by the policy conference. But as I said, those resolutions become recommendations to the conference that will then would be held at the end of the year with the delegates of the ANC that will finally look at them as a final look. And then once they look at it, they then take resolutions, which then they become resolutions finalized by the ANC process.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. President, at the conference you said that there's a need for a radical shift. Can you explain to us what exactly you mean by this?
Well, I mean exactly what I say, radical change. Part of the issue in terms of the South African setting, you have a situation where there are challenges that face us. There have been challenges before, but I'm now, comparatively speaking, talking about since 1994. We've had our policies. I think we've done very well. But there are challenges that have been persisting. Poverty, inequality, unemployment. With our correct policies that we've been having, and we've been trying our level best to tackle these. And the point I was making, we can't continue, it can't be business as usual. What can we do to address these three challenges? This is a summary of many of other challenges. What can we do? And the point I was making, we need to take a radical shift in terms of what is it that we can do to address these. We could not continue as if we don't have these challenges. That's why we're then saying, looking at the kind of things that we're doing, what else can we do? Part of the policies that we have, for an example, I've talked about the new growth path. How vigorously do we implement this? If we then come out to say, for an example, here, we talked about 6 drivers. How do we implement these 6 drivers? And one of them is infrastructure. We have taken very radical position to deal with that. That's what we are talking about. Vigorously to say, if it is agreed, what kind of resources do we put in it? What plan? What is it that we do? So we have actually articulated what kind of things we are doing. In other words, we can no longer just say we've got nice policies about agriculture, about that one, without vigorously taking positions that we are able to move and shift the manner in which we move. How do we induce the economy so that the economy is able to produce jobs?
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things in the new growth path that speaks to this change is, of course, the fact that historical problems in the South African economy is the fact that there's an absence of linkages into the regional and African, hubs. We're still doing our trade with the US and with the EU. The problem is that we're not doing enough trade on the continent. What are you doing to integrate South Africa's economy into these regional and continental hubs and, in fact, increase intra-Africa trade, Mr. President?
Of course, firstly, before even getting into the region or the continent, within the country, we have said we cannot continue working in silos in terms of departments, etc. We must be able to coordinate things. And that's why when it came to the infrastructure, we established the Presidential Commission, which is not just a commission just to stand there. The commission that must coordinate the work of government. In other words, do things differently, as we have been saying, as a country. That, I think, has introduced a new way of really addressing the challenges more visibly. But we have also discussed in SADC, how much can we create integration in terms of our infrastructure, how do we work together? But we have gone further to other regional economy in the continent. You'll recall that 3 regions have come together, which come together in terms of the common kind of relationship in the economy, the kind of economic activities that would not have barriers. And we have put together a huge, almost half of the population of the continent. But we have also taken the NAPAD, which is the program of the continent, and looked at it at very specific issues. We've looked at the infrastructure, all of it, communication, rail and road, and every other thing. So Africa has actually taken a decision. We did not just end up there. The summit, which was held in Uganda, we took a decision that heads of state should actually champion specific infrastructure thing. South Africa chairs the infrastructure in the corridor from north to south or south to north. I think all of those activities indicate that we are doing things differently in order to integrate. We have recognized that whilst we trade with everybody else in the world, but there was no intra-trade within the continent. We are now working out strategies, how to ensure that we have intra-trade. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of effort that we are putting there, as well as beginning to link up with other countries in the South-South relations.
Let's talk about that linkages, Mr. President, particularly the relationship with China. Now, one of our partners in BRICS, the world's fastest economy, growing economy rather, has Africa's single biggest trading partner, China. But you've recently indicated that this relationship between Africa and China is skewed, and that we need to address it. Will you elaborate, please, on what you see as the problem and what can Africa and China do to remedy that situation?
Well, we met in China recently in the China-Africa Forum, question of a few weeks ago, had a lot of discussions in that regard to say, how do we deepen this relationship between China and Africa? Now, as you know, each country would be having relations with China, much as in a forum we all come together. We have been saying we need to create mechanisms that must look at how these relationships are actually going forward. We have said, because this trade is skewed, how do you correct it? We must have a very deliberate mechanism to say, what is it that we get from China, and what is that China gets from Africa? Africa in itself has said, we needed to sit down, and we agreed in Beijing recently that we need to balance this. First, bilaterally, we, for an example, in South Africa, very clear as we met with China, how much we need to balance this, and it is agreed. And we are going to establish a special joint mechanism to look at these two countries. We are going to replicate that in terms of Africa, to have the AU kind of mechanism that must look at how this trade is being done. We must balance it. And we do this informed by one important thing, that we are dealing with China. That is not taking us in a form of former colonial thing. They're taking us as partners. If that is the case, this must be seen in practice. We must therefore all participate to identify where are the issues. Some of the things, for an example, we are looking at. How do we establish the beneficiation in the continent? And I think China is ready to do so, to participate in that. If you were in Angola, what you put in place in terms of the economy, to develop the industry there. Whatever country you are, as China, given what you have. So these are matters we are looking at, partly because we have an experience that we have been trading with other regions for centuries. It has not made any difference. Now we are saying, as organized continent or region, which is fast growing, where do we put our expertise to deal with this? China itself, in recognizing this, has said it is going to offer a lot of scholarships to help skill people in the continent so that these skills could be passed over to the African continent. So that's a kind of relationship which I think is going to take us somewhere.